cotton gin wheel turned in the haze of morning, its wooden spokes groaning with every slow revolution. But this time the machine carried something far more chilling than cotton. Swinging from the central axle, turning with dreadful rhythm, was the severed head of Charles Morton blood, dripping in steady beats onto the floorboards below. The slaves nearby froze in shock, unable to look away from the glassy eyes that seemed to follow them with each spin of the wheel. Abel Johnson was nowhere to be seen. He had slipped into the Charleston marshlands after delivering the most brutal act of defiance Magnolia Grove Plantation had ever known. Abel's story, though, didn't begin with that violent night in 1834, but 23 years earlier in the cramped slave quarters of Magnolia Grove. His mother, Susanna, labored for 18 grueling hours, whispering desperate prayers that her child might be born free, though she knew freedom was not theirs to hope for. The moment Abel drew his first breath, he became the property of Master Jonathan Whitmore, listed like livestock alongside the horses, cattle, and fields. Susanna cradled him gently that night, whispering promises she could never truly keep, that he would grow strong, find happiness, and maybe see a world beyond bondage. Her words were drowned by the relentless toll of the plantation bell calling workers into the fields. A mocking reminder that freedom was a dream reserved for others. Abel grew up in the rhythm of endless toil, his childhood measured by the seasons of cotton planting and harvest. He learned to walk among the white blossoms, his tiny hands stained brown from the oil, his back aching under the Carolina sun, before he was old enough to understand the meaning of pain. By 7, his fingers bore the scars of labor, his spine already warped from bending low to the plants, yet his mind shone with a sharpness that others could not ignore. Abel remembered every detail of work assignments, crop rotations, and planting schedules. A gift that caught the attention of Charles Morton, the new overseer who arrived when Abel was 10. Morton was unlike the men before him. Where others maintained control with occasional cruelty, he seemed to delight in suffering. Lean, pale-eyed, and cold, he carried a whip of his own design laced with metal barbs that tore flesh with every strike. His boots echoed like a warning across the wooden walkways, a sound that turned stomachs to stone. Abel's first taste of Morton's wrath came at 12. He had been repairing storm-damaged fencing with his uncle Jeremiah, a kind man who had once taught him to carve small animals from wood in rare moments of rest. They worked quietly, carefully, until Morton appeared out of nowhere, inspecting their labor like cattle at auction. The fence held firm, but Morton's cruelty needed no reason. He accused Abel of working too slowly, of laziness, of setting a dangerous example. It was the beginning of a torment that would carve itself deep into Abel's life and set in motion the path that would one day lead to rebellion and blood. Before Abel could speak in his own defense, Morton's whip sliced through the humid air, the barbed leather tearing straight through the thin fabric of the boy's shirt and carving 3 bloody stripes across his back. The pain was immediate and consuming, a burning that spread with every heartbeat. Yet worse than the pain was the humiliation, the cruel certainty that he had done nothing wrong and was suffering only because Morton wanted to see him suffer. Abel clenched his jaw, biting down so hard he tasted his own blood, refusing to cry out, refusing to give the overseer the satisfaction. Morton's eyes narrowed in disappointment, as if silence robbed him of the thrill he sought. That night, Susanna worked by the dim glow of a candle, cleaning and dressing her son's wounds with strips of cloth torn from her dress and a poultice of herbs she had learned to harvest from the swamps. She said little, but the fury etched into her face spoke volumes. Abel saw it in her eyes, the same burning rage that now lived inside him, but had no safe place to go. All it could do was fester, hidden inside the dangerous realm of dreams, the kind that whispered of revenge. Over the years, that fire only grew. Abel's body hardened from endless labor, his mind sharpened by the constant need to survive Morton's unpredictable cruelty. He became a master of reading the overseer's moods, sometimes working with exaggerated obedience to avoid notice, sometimes drawing Morton's wrath away from weaker slaves who could not endure it. By 20, Abel was already a figure of quiet legend among the enslaved. His tall frame and powerful shoulders could carry more cotton than 2 men, and his endurance seemed endless. But it wasn't only strength that set him apart, it was his awareness. He knew who could be trusted with small favors, who would betray even a whisper of defiance, how to navigate the hidden lines between field workers and house servants. He had perfected the art of survival, lowering his eyes at just the right moment, saying, "Yes, sir," with the exact tone that sounded submissive but never servile, moving with precision that suggested obedience but concealed resistance. Outwardly, Abel looked like the model of compliance. Inwardly, his rage smoldered hotter with each passing day, every cruelty another log on a fire he could barely contain. That fire found its breaking point on a heavy August evening in 1834. Abel was alone in the cotton gin house, operating the dangerous machinery that could shred flesh as easily as it stripped seeds from cotton. The air was thick with dust, hot with the grinding of wheels and teeth. He worked with steady precision ahead of schedule on an order Whitmore demanded for Charleston. Then Morton appeared in the doorway. The sour stench of whiskey reached Abel before the man's words did. Experience told him this was the most dangerous version of Morton, drunk, restless, and eager to find fault. The overseer prowled the room, pawing through the clean cotton, checking the wheels, testing the teeth. Everything was in flawless order, and Abel knew it, but Morton's irritation only grew. He turned on Abel with accusation after accusation, too slow, too careless, too arrogant, too full of himself. Each word was a spark against Abel's long-suppressed fury. For years he had swallowed his anger, forced it down into silence. But that night, with the dust clogging his lungs and Morton's pale eyes boring into him, he felt the chains inside him beginning to crack. Abel forced himself to keep his voice steady. His eyes lowered, his words respectful. But inside, something deep and long buried began to break. The crack widened when Morton shifted from accusing Abel of insolence to threatening his mother. The overseer's crude taunting words were like physical blows, each one landing harder than the last. Susanna was the one person Abel loved above all else, the only soul who had ever given him warmth in a world of chains and cruelty. To hear her degraded in such vile terms was more than he could endure. His hands, usually sure and steady as they guided cotton through the machine's teeth, began to shake. His breath came fast and shallow. Sweat gathered at his brow despite the cool of evening. Morton sensed the shift, and like a predator smelling blood, leaned in further, describing in grotesque detail what he planned to do, how he would force Abel to watch, how he would remind them both of their place. That was the moment something inside Abel snapped. A lifetime of submission, humiliation, and rage erupted in a single instant. For the first time as a grown man, he lifted his eyes and met Morton's pale gaze without flinching. The overseer faltered, taking a half step back, his hand twitching toward the whip at his belt. But Abel was already moving. His fingers closed around the handle of a woodcutter's axe resting on a nearby bench. The weight felt natural, as though it had been waiting in that spot for this very moment. Morton was still fumbling for his weapon when the axe came down. The blade split through skin and bone above his ears, silencing him before a sound could escape. Abel ripped the weapon free and struck again, the steel sinking into Morton's forehead with a sickening crunch. The overseer collapsed in a heap, twitching for a moment before going still. Blood spread across the planks, dark and thick, mixing with cotton dust until it clung to Abel's bare feet like clay. The gin machinery kept its rhythm wheels turning and teeth clicking, oblivious to the carnage. Abel stood frozen over the body chest, heaving, mind reeling. The rage that had driven him to strike was already fading, replaced by a mix of grim satisfaction and cold dread. He knew what would come next: discovery questions, torture, retribution. But fear no longer held him. He had done what so many had only dreamed. He had struck back, and the overseer was dead. If death was certain, then he would not let it be meaningless. He would turn this moment into something unforgettable. Moving with the same precision he used for every task, Abel set to work with the axe again, sawing through flesh and bone until Morton's head finally came free. Blood coated his arms, the floor, a slaughterhouse scene. He lifted the severed head and carried it to the great wheel that powered the gin. With strips of leather cut from Morton's own belt, he lashed it to the axle, careful to angle the face toward the entrance. When the job was done, he stepped back. The wheel groaned as it turned, the overseer's face rising and falling, with each rotation, his empty eyes staring out into the dark. The plantation's heart of industry had become a theater of vengeance, and Abel knew the image would haunt anyone who saw it. Abel watched the overseer's head swing with each slow turn of the cotton gin wheel, its lifeless eyes catching the lantern light at different angles as though staring into every shadowed corner of the room. Blood dripped steadily from the severed neck, pooling on the floorboards in a dark, widening circle, the steady rhythm of it giving the entire scene a grim, ritual-like power. For the first time in his life, Abel felt something close to release. But there was no time to linger. Dawn would bring the workers, and with them the discovery. He needed to vanish into the marsh before the hounds were set loose. Moving silently through the darkness, Abel returned to the slave quarters one last time. He slipped inside his mother's small cabin, touching her shoulder gently. Susanna startled awake, her instincts sharp, but the sight of his blood-stained clothes told her everything before he whispered a word. She didn't scream. She didn't scold. She simply listened while he spoke in hushed tones, telling her what had been done. He gathered what little he could carry: an extra shirt, a knife, a piece of flint. And Susanna, with a look of grim resolve, handed him a small bundle of food she had hidden away from her rations. She kissed his forehead, as she had when he was a child. Neither of them said goodbye. Words were unnecessary. Both knew this was their last moment together. She walked with him to the edge of the quarters, where fields gave way to the thick swamplands. She watched him disappear into the dark, her son no longer a slave. But something far more dangerous, a symbol that would linger in every whispered story of resistance. Abel slipped into the marsh like he belonged there. He knew the ways through the wetlands, the high ground safe from quicksand, the plants that could be eaten, the places where water ran fresh. He knew how to move silently, how to leave no trail. As dawn neared, he found a hollowed cypress trunk and crouched inside, waiting for the discovery he knew was coming. It came with the first screams. They echoed across the fields. When the morning shift entered the gin house and saw the wheel turning with its gruesome burden, panic spread among the slaves. White voices shouted orders and curses as Master Whitmore and his men tried to comprehend the scene. Abel smiled grimly in his hiding place. He could picture it all: the horror, the confusion, the fear. By noon, the manhunt was in motion. Armed men stormed the slave quarters, tearing through cabins, dragging people out, demanding answers. Susanna kept her silence, her face unreadable even under threat. Dogs were brought in, but Abel had thought ahead. He walked through water, smeared his clothes with strong scented marsh plants, and the hounds spun uselessly in circles. Frustration mounted as the hours passed. By nightfall, search parties pushed further into the low country, the militia patrolling roads and waterways, rewards posted in Charleston taverns and markets for his capture. The story spread faster than the search could. Word of the cotton gin spectacle leapt from plantation to plantation, amplified by newspapers hungry for sensation. People whispered about Abel's act with a mix of fascination and dread. It wasn't just murder. It was theater, a rebellion carved into memory with blood and iron. Overseers across the South tightened their grip. Owners added patrols, chains, and watchmen, all to keep their fears at bay. Yet Abel had already vanished into the marshland, where only a man with his skill could live unseen. To the world, he became more than a fugitive. He became a ghost. A story told in hushed voices, a symbol of rage that could never again be fully chained. Abel adapted quickly to life in the marsh, building a network of makeshift shelters that he rotated through, never staying in one place long enough for hunters to catch his trail. He survived on fish, small game, and wild plants, relying on knowledge he had gained as a child, exploring those same swamps. The mosquitoes, snakes, and constant damp were hardships, but they were nothing compared to the weight he carried inside. Each night, as he tried to rest, he saw Morton's head spinning on the cotton gin wheel, in his mind the pale eyes fixed on him, accusing and unblinking. Abel didn't regret killing the man. He never would, but he could not escape the thought that others had paid the price for his rebellion. Within a week of Morton's death, Master Whitmore had brought in a new overseer, a man named Crawford. Crawford made Morton look almost merciful by comparison. Determined to crush any possibility of resistance, he ruled through terror. The stories that reached Abel through the hidden network of enslaved voices were brutal whippings. For the smallest misstep, families torn apart and sold away, food rations cut so low that starvation loomed. Abel knew his actions had triggered this storm, but deep down he understood the truth. Slavery itself was the real source of the suffering. His strike had not created cruelty. It had only ripped away the mask, showing what had always been there. As months stretched into years, Abel's story spread across the South Carolina Low Country and beyond. It grew with each retelling. To some, he became a phantom who struck down multiple overseers before vanishing. To others, he was a liberator who freed scores of slaves in daring midnight raids. Some even whispered that he had supernatural protection, that the swamps themselves shielded him. The truth was simpler. Abel survived alone in the marshlands for nearly 2 years, scarred by solitude, but alive. At times, he helped fugitives traveling north on the Underground Railroad, guiding them through dangerous waters and hidden trails, though he never joined them. His name was too notorious, his presence too dangerous for others to risk. When his end came, it was neither heroic nor dramatic, but sudden and efficient. In the spring of 1836, while foraging for wild onions in a familiar patch of swamp, he stumbled into an ambush. A band of professional slave catchers, men who made fortunes tracking fugitives, had studied his habits patiently, watching where he hunted and traveled. Abel barely had time to register the danger before he was surrounded. Exhausted from years of constant vigilance, he offered no real resistance. Heavy chains closed around his wrists and ankles, and for the first time since that August night, Abel Johnson was a prisoner again. He was dragged back to Charleston and locked in the city jail, the place where countless others had awaited punishment. His trial lasted less than a day, little more than a formality. He was not allowed to speak in his own defense, and no one dared to stand for him. The prosecution had all the proof it needed: plantation testimony, witnesses, and even the axe itself dug up near one of his old shelters, still stained with Morton's blood. The outcome was never in doubt. Abel's fate had been sealed the moment he raised that weapon in the gin house. Abel sat through the trial with the same quiet endurance that had carried him through a lifetime of oppression. Witnesses recited their accounts, the judge delivered the verdict, and the sentence of death by hanging was handed down without hesitation. Abel only nodded as though the outcome had been written from the very moment he lifted the axe in the gin house. His execution was set for the following week. In Charleston's public square, designed as a spectacle, a warning to anyone who might even imagine rebellion. The city swelled with visitors eager to witness the event. Merchants hawked food and drink to the crowds, and authorities made sure the gallows stood tall, a symbol of what awaited those who dared defy the order of things. But on the morning of the execution, when guards came to escort him from his cell, they found it empty. The lock had been shattered from the inside, though the heavy stone walls bore no marks, and the narrow window was too small for any man to squeeze through. Abel Johnson had vanished. Panic swept the jail. Then the city. Search parties combed the streets, the harbor, the surrounding countryside. Rumors sprouted immediately. Some swore they saw a tall man boarding a ship bound for the north. Others claimed he was spotted slipping into the coastal woods. None of the sightings were ever proven, and no trace of him was ever recovered. Abel had disappeared into legend, and that legend only grew. Across the South, enslaved communities told his story in whispers by firelight. In one version, he returned at night to Magnolia Grove, comforting those still suffering under the lash. In another, he founded a hidden refuge deep in the swamp, teaching fugitives how to survive and fight. Others insisted he had gained supernatural powers, able to appear and vanish at will, striking fear into the hearts of overseers from Carolina to Georgia. The cotton gin wheel, where Morton's head once turned, became a shrine of sorts. Enslaved people from nearby plantations would risk punishment just to glimpse it, claiming the wheel sometimes turned by itself, even when the steam engine lay cold, moved by Abel's spirit. Master Whitmore eventually had the machine dismantled and replaced. But whispers persisted. The new gin was said to carry the same haunted energy, the same restless reminder of what had been done there. Abel's defiance shook more than one plantation. Slaveholders responded with new laws and harsher controls. Slaves forbidden to gather in groups, punishments escalated for the smallest signs of resistance, patrols sent out to stalk every road and river. But repression could not erase the memory. Abel Johnson had proved that one man could tear through the veil of submission and strike at the system itself. His act became a cornerstone of African American folklore, a reminder passed from one generation to the next that even the most oppressed carried within them the fire of resistance. As decades passed, abolitionists seized on his story, pointing to it as evidence that slavery's cruelty would always breed rebellion. Writers and artists drew from the haunting image of the cotton gin wheel, with Morton's head seeing in it a symbol of the cycle of oppression and revenge, of the violence that slavery demanded and the violence it inevitably provoked. To them, Abel was not merely a fugitive. He was a sign of things to come, a shadow of the war that would one day tear the South apart. Modern historians have struggled to separate truth from legend in the tale of Abel Johnson. The surviving records are thin and contradictory, offering little more than fragments. Plantation documents from Magnolia Grove confirm that an overseer named Charles Morton was indeed killed in August of 1834, and that a slave named Abel was accused of the crime. Beyond that, the trail blurs into speculation. Accounts differ on how Morton died, whether his body was mutilated, and what became of Abel afterward. Yet even with these uncertainties, one fact is clear. The story has left an indelible mark on American cultural memory. The tale of Abel Johnson captures something essential about the experience of slavery: the tension between outward compliance and the fire of defiance burning beneath. The image of Morton's head fixed to the cotton gin wheel endures as one of the most haunting symbols of resistance, a grotesque challenge to white supremacy, a reminder that the system's violence could be met with violence in return. Though the swamplands where Abel was said to have hidden have long since been drained and developed, whispers remain. Locals tell of ghostly figures wandering the marshes on moonless nights, spirits of lost fugitives, or perhaps Abel himself still roaming the land where he defied capture. Over time, the cotton gin itself faded into obsolescence, replaced by machines more efficient and less dependent on enslaved labor. But its symbolic weight persists. It was both a marvel of invention and a tool of bondage, representing progress bought at the cost of human suffering. In Abel's story, the gin became more than machinery. It became the stage upon which an unforgettable act of defiance was displayed. Ultimately, the story of Abel Johnson straddles the line between history and myth. It tells truths about slavery and rebellion even as it bends or invents details. His defiance embodies the idea that even the harshest system contains within it the seeds of its own undoing. The image of Morton's severed head turning with the wheel is one of the most visceral emblems of slave resistance ever recorded, a reminder of the terrible cost of oppression and the relentless drive for dignity and vengeance. And yet, Abel's story did not end in Charleston. Legends multiplied in the years after his supposed escape. In 1837, nearly a year after he vanished from jail, slave catchers in the borderlands of South Carolina and Georgia claimed to have encountered him. They found not a broken fugitive, but a leader standing tall at the center of a clearing, surrounded by a band of runaways who looked to him with reverence. The bounty hunters demanded his surrender. Abel only smiled and shook his head. What followed defied their expectations. Instead of scattering in panic, Abel and his companions melted into the swamp, using the land itself as a weapon. They struck from the shadows with a precision that suggested long planning, turning the hunters into the hunted. By nightfall, 3 of the professional man-catchers lay dead, killed by arrows that seemed to appear from nowhere. For the survivors, the encounter was less a failed capture than a nightmare, one that confirmed the whispers already spreading through the South. That Abel Johnson had become something more than a man. The surviving bounty hunters staggered out of the swamp, broken men leaving behind their horses, weapons, and pride. In their reports to Savannah officials, they spoke of shadows that moved like men, but struck like spirits of arrows flying from nowhere, of a figure who seemed immune to death itself. Local authorities scoffed, dismissing their testimony as the delirium of men undone by heat and fear. Yet the story refused to die. It traveled along the hidden channels of enslaved communication, passed in whispered prayers, carried in work songs woven into the secret gatherings that white overseers feared but could never entirely suppress. By the time it reached distant plantations, Abel Johnson was no longer just a man. He was a conjure warrior, invulnerable to bullets, invisible to his enemies, the living embodiment of retribution. The truth, however, was both less mystical and more extraordinary. Abel had survived, and not merely survived, he had built something lasting in the swamps of the Low Country. With years of experience navigating the marshes, he could outwit pursuers simply by knowing where the mud turned treacherous or where the cypress roots hid safe paths invisible to outsiders. What looked like sorcery was skill and patience honed into mastery. More than that, Abel's mind had shifted from survival to strategy. He began to gather others, men and women who had broken free from bondage and stumbled into the wetlands in search of safety. But Abel did not let his sanctuary become a haven of mere survival. He forged it into something greater. The fugitives under his protection were not the ragged, desperate souls the catchers expected to find. Abel handpicked them, testing their resolve, teaching them, shaping them into something white society could not imagine: an organized fighting force. Their weapons were crude, but devastating. Marsh reeds became arrows, scrap iron sharpened into spearheads, swamp grass braided into nets, capable of pulling horsemen from their saddles. They learned to set traps that turned the land itself into a weapon, to fight not as individuals, but as a disciplined unit, moving with one mind under Abel's command. Life in the hidden settlement was harsh, but astonishingly advanced. Abel oversaw the building of sleeping platforms high in the cypress trees, safe from predators and invisible to intruders. Concealed gardens sprouted on remote islands, producing beans, squash, and medicinal herbs to supplement fish and game. Rainwater was harvested in carefully designed catchments, while freshwater springs, discovered through endless scouting, provided reliable drinking water. What Abel was constructing was more than a camp. It was a community, a new society carved out of the wilderness, built on freedom and resistance. Perhaps the most radical part of Abel's vision was his insistence on learning. Slavery thrived on ignorance, stripping enslaved people of education as carefully as it stripped them of freedom. Abel refused that legacy. During his solitary years of hiding, he had scavenged discarded books and newspapers, teaching himself to read by firelight, piecing together meaning word by word. In the swamp settlement, he passed on that knowledge. New arrivals not only learned to fish and trap, they learned letters, numbers, strategy. For the first time in their lives, many could imagine a future beyond labor and chains. In doing so, Abel Johnson transformed from fugitive into something greater. A general without an army, a teacher without a schoolhouse, a prophet whose battlefield was the swamp itself. His settlement blurred the line between myth and reality, so much so that when his name spread across the South, no one could quite agree on where the man ended and the legend began. Under Abel's leadership, the swamp settlement became more than a refuge. It was a school of freedom. By firelight and in hidden clearings, he taught men and women who had once been treated as property to read, write, and calculate. They traced maps with sticks in the dirt, memorizing rivers, roads, and hidden trails. They studied not only the landscape, but the structure of the society that had enslaved them, learning how cotton became profit, how profit became power, and how striking at that chain could weaken the entire plantation order. Abel insisted that they see themselves not as fugitives or criminals, but as soldiers in a just war. Every lesson reinforced a single truth. Their struggle was not theft or rebellion, but a righteous campaign for human freedom. This moral framework gave their actions purpose and resilience. When Abel's raiders struck, they did so with precision. They were not reckless mobs, but disciplined units carrying out carefully chosen missions. Instead of slaughtering indiscriminately, they targeted the machinery of slavery itself. Cotton gins, presses, and storage barns filled with harvests ready for market. They freed supplies that could feed their settlement, recruited the strongest and most willing from the enslaved population, and then vanished back into the swamp before white militias could respond. To those left behind, they left carved messages and painted signs, proof that Abel lived, proof that resistance was possible. These markings served as more than taunts to overseers. They were signals to the enslaved, whispers turned into symbols, promises of escape routes and hope. To the white planters, they were psychological blows, reminders that control was not absolute, that rebellion could flare at any moment. The raids had real economic consequences. Destroyed machinery forced expensive replacements. Fields went untended as slaves and overseers alike were kept in a state of fear, always watching for shadows in the tree line. The steady trickle of runaways who joined Abel's settlement became a flood in some areas, shrinking the labor force and cutting deeply into productivity. Insurance companies, spooked by mounting losses, refused to cover crops and equipment in regions touched by Abel's influence. Plantation owners turned to hired mercenaries, but outsiders rarely lasted long. The swamp belonged to Abel and his people, and their traps, ambushes, and intimate knowledge of the land made them nearly impossible to root out. The cumulative effect was more devastating than any one raid. In pockets of the Carolina and Georgia coast, slavery simply became less profitable. What had once been the most lucrative economy in America showed cracks forced not only by politics and abolitionist pressure, but by the invisible war waged from the marshlands. Abel Johnson had turned the tools of survival into weapons of resistance, and the system that once claimed to own him now paid a heavy price for its cruelty. As Abel Johnson's reputation spread, he ceased to be merely a man and became a symbol. His name traveled in whispers and hymns, carried along the same hidden channels that bore coded songs and sermons of resistance. Plantation fields echoed with spirituals that secretly mapped escape routes, while preachers spoke of divine judgment, weaving Abel's defiance into their visions of deliverance. For countless enslaved people, he became more than a fugitive leader. He was a living prophecy, a figure whose defiance embodied their own yearning for freedom. The authorities recognized the danger. What began as bounties and slave catchers escalated into military campaigns. Armed patrols with dogs and local guides plunged into the swamps, determined to root out Abel's community before its influence spread further. Rewards for his capture reached unheard-of sums, attracting hunters from as far as Louisiana and Virginia. Yet the swamp was Abel's fortress. He had learned bitter lessons from his earlier capture in Charleston and transformed his people into a mobile, disciplined force. His community operated like smoke impossible to grasp, always shifting. Organized into small units, they could scatter when threatened, then regroup along hidden paths marked with symbols only they could read. Their platforms in the trees, their gardens on isolated islands, their caches of weapons, all could be abandoned overnight. When soldiers stormed through one camp, they found only cold ashes and empty branches. Abel's followers needed no supply chains, no outside help. They lived entirely from the land. Their independence made them untouchable. The swamps themselves became weapons. White militias and bounty hunters stumbled through mud and quicksand, fell prey to fevers carried by mosquitoes, or blundered into traps disguised as natural hazards. Alligators and snakes claimed more intruders than Abel's arrows ever did. To the soldiers, it felt less like chasing rebels than fighting spirits. Weeks of fruitless pursuit left men broken, their commanders humiliated, their resources drained. Every failure deepened the mystique around Abel. Every retreat fed the notion that he was more than human. Among the enslaved, the myth blossomed. His story absorbed elements from many traditions: African folklore, biblical prophecy, native survival lore. Some swore Abel could commune with the spirits of the dead, gathering intelligence from the ancestors themselves. Others claimed he wielded strength beyond mortal limits, wrestling alligators with his bare hands or leaping from tree to tree like a phantom. These embellishments weren't just fantasy. They transformed his rebellion into a sacred narrative, a cosmic struggle of good against evil that gave enslaved people both hope and courage. The myths also served a more practical function. Wrapped in legend, Abel's story could disguise real strategies. Songs about his supposed invisibility encoded instructions for moving unseen. Tales of his spectral allies concealed warnings about patrols. If questioned, an enslaved person could pass these stories off as harmless superstition, even as they carried vital intelligence about survival and escape. By the late 1830s, Abel Johnson had become less a fugitive than a movement. His flesh and blood deeds had blurred into legend, and his legend into a cultural weapon. A living story that kept alive the knowledge that resistance was possible. In whispers and songs and ghost tales around the fire, Abel's spirit walked the South, reminding every man, woman, and child in bondage that chains could be broken. The stories told about Abel Johnson were more than folklore. They were living codes. A tale about him walking on water could point to shallow fords in rivers where fugitives might cross undetected. Legends of invisibility often masked instructions on how to move silently through hostile terrain. These layered meanings allowed enslaved people to share knowledge in plain sight, disguising maps and tactics as myth. But Abel's influence extended well beyond the swamps and fields of the South. His legend became fuel in the national debate over slavery itself. Northern abolitionists seized on his story, printing pamphlets and articles that cast him as a freedom fighter, a man who had simply met violence with violence. To them, Abel was proof that slavery bred rebellion, that no human being would endure such cruelty forever without striking back. His acts were framed as just even righteous, a grim prophecy of what would happen if the system persisted. In contrast, Southern defenders of slavery twisted the tale to fit their fears. They erased Charles Morton's brutality from the record, recasting Abel not as a man driven to desperation, but as a bloodthirsty criminal. To them, Abel justified harsher laws, tighter chains, and more brutal punishments. His name became a warning of what could happen if enslaved people were not kept under relentless control. By the 1840s, Abel's legend was no longer confined to South Carolina. Reports, half rumor, half testimony, placed him leading raids in Georgia, Florida, even as far west as Alabama and Mississippi. Some insisted he had built a vast network of fugitive communities, each linked to the next by secret codes and signals. Others argued that imitators had simply adopted his name, turning Abel Johnson into a banner under which resistance could rally. The truth likely lay in between. Abel's tactics had spread his legend, inspiring others, his methods teaching them how to fight and survive. Intelligence gathered by Southern militias hinted at something unprecedented, a loose confederation of Maroon-style settlements stretching across the coastal wetlands. They were decentralized, yet connected, each echoing Abel's original model of mobility, coded communication, and disciplined strikes. Ciphers carved into trees, hidden chalk marks on bridges. Bridges and word passed through trusted couriers allowed these groups to share intelligence and coordinate raids. To plantation owners, it felt as if a single shadowy hand directed the resistance. The economic toll could no longer be ignored. Insurance companies drove up rates or refused coverage entirely in areas touched by Abel's legend. Plantation owners poured money into private militias and guard patrols, cutting into their profits. More devastating still was the steady drain of labor. Every runaway who vanished into the swamps represented not only lost property, but also reduced productivity, rising replacement costs, and the gnawing fear that others would follow. This pressure deepened divisions within the South itself. A handful of planters began to experiment with small reforms, slightly better food, fewer hours in the field, less arbitrary cruelty, in hopes of reducing the lure of escape. But such measures enraged hardliners, who denounced them as weakness. They argued that only harsher discipline could keep rebellion at bay. The argument mirrored the larger fracture in Southern society: reform versus rigidity, conciliation versus control. Abel Johnson's ghost haunted those debates, his name evoked as proof of both hope and terror, depending on who was speaking. By the late 1840s, Abel Johnson's legend had ceased to be a regional whisper, and instead became woven into the national struggle over slavery itself. His story, once a tale traded in secret along the quarters and sung in coded hymns, was now invoked openly in the halls of politics and printed in newspapers from Boston to New Orleans. Abolitionists hailed him as proof that enslaved people would never quietly accept bondage. His acts of defiance, they argued, were not aberrations, but the natural outcome of an unnatural system. Pro-slavery politicians, on the other hand, brandished his name as a specter of violence, a warning that stronger federal enforcement was needed to protect white families from the threat of rebellion. The image of the man who once displayed his overseer's severed head on a cotton gin wheel had hardened into a national symbol. A grotesque reminder of the irreconcilable divide between North and South. With the gold rush of 1849, Abel's legend traveled even farther. Migrants bound for California carried his story westward, telling of the swamp rebel who struck fear into planters. Among miners and settlers, many hostile to the plantation aristocracy, these tales found eager audiences. More importantly, the flood of people moving across the South created new opportunities for escape. Disguised fugitives blended into the streams of travelers boarding ships or joining wagon trains bound for free soil. Abel, ever the strategist, adapted. By the early 1850s, his community was running what was essentially a southern branch of the Underground Railroad. He and his lieutenants shepherded fugitives through swamps to coastal ports, where sympathetic sailors or bribed captains ferried them toward freedom. What had begun as a hidden survival colony now resembled a guerrilla army with a logistical network supplying training and transporting runaways, while continuing to wage economic sabotage against plantations. Southern officials responded with new levels of repression. Military garrisons stationed near wetlands, patrols drilled in anti-rebellion tactics, and ever harsher laws aimed at deterring escape. Yet geography and morale remained against them. The swamp was Abel's domain, and the enslaved population fueled by his legend provided him an unshakable base of support. By the dawn of the 1850s, Abel Johnson had become something unprecedented in American history. An escaped slave commanding an independent mobile military force that had waged sustained resistance for nearly 2 decades. His personal journey from one man's vengeance to an organized insurgency paralleled the country's own shift. Slavery was no longer just a regional issue. It was the crisis at the heart of the nation. When Lincoln's election in 1860 brought the Republican Party's pledge to halt slavery's expansion into the territories, Southern leaders saw it as the beginning of the end. South Carolina's secession that December formalized the split. In this climate, Abel's story became more than folklore, it became prophecy. For abolitionists, he was the embodiment of the rebellion they believed would rise in tandem with Union armies, a sign that enslaved people would seize their own freedom when the opportunity came. For Southern secessionists, he was proof of their worst suspicions, that the North had always been complicit in fomenting resistance, that the shadows in their swamps were not only Abel's men, but the first wave of a greater war already unfolding. The Civil War transformed Abel Johnson from a fugitive leader into something larger than any one man could have imagined. As Union armies pushed deeper into the South and enslaved people fled to federal lines. In overwhelming numbers, the guerrilla networks Abel had pioneered suddenly had a new purpose. What had begun as isolated raids and hidden camps in the swamps evolved into infrastructure for mass emancipation. Fugitive communities became supply points, guides became scouts, and the strategies of survival Abel had refined in the marshes now supported the Union war effort. Reports from the time suggest Abel himself may have taken part directing escapees toward Union camps, advising federal officers on terrain, even coordinating strikes against Confederate supply lines. Yet by 1861, the line between fact and legend had blurred so completely that no account could be verified. Was it Abel himself or men inspired by him who aided the Union forces? The truth is less important than the impact his story had lit a fire that refused to go out, shaping a culture of resistance that played no small part in the downfall of the slave system. The The raids Abel initiated, and those carried on in his name, weakened the plantation economy at the very moment the Confederacy needed it most. His escape routes, once a trickle of fugitives, became arteries carrying thousands toward freedom. And his legend, circulating in whispers, songs, and prayers, reminded enslaved people that bondage was not destiny. It convinced them that organized struggle, whether through violence or flight, could win liberty. After emancipation, Abel's name lived on. His tale became a kind of scripture in African American communities, a story retold whenever oppression demanded courage. During Reconstruction, as black citizens faced violent backlash for claiming their rights, his legend offered a model of uncompromising defiance. Under Jim Crow, when terror and disenfranchisement pressed down, stories of Abel's triumph provided inspiration that dignity and resistance were possible even under the harshest conditions. The Great Migration carried Abel's story northward, where it found new audiences in Chicago, Detroit, New York. For migrants leaving the South, his legend symbolized not just physical escape, but cultural survival. The reminder that their ancestors had fought back and that their fight continued. By the mid-20th century, civil rights activists looked to him as a historical forerunner. Their tactics were different marches instead of ambushes, sit-ins instead of raids, but the principle was the same. Oppression must never be accepted as permanent. Historians today still wrestle with Abel Johnson's elusive truth. Archaeological digs in Carolina and Georgia wetlands have uncovered evidence of fugitive settlements, platform dwellings, garden plots. Makeshift tools that confirm communities like those described in his legend once existed. Whether Abel was a singular leader or a composite figure shaped by collective memory may never be known. But this ambiguity only enhances his cultural significance. The myth allowed generations to project their own struggles onto his story, transforming him into a timeless emblem of resistance. And still the image endures, a severed head turning on a cotton gin wheel, dripping blood onto the boards below. It remains one of the most vivid and unsettling symbols in American folklore, a reminder that systems built on brutality inevitably provoke brutality in return until the cycle is broken. Abel Johnson, whether man or myth, captures something fundamental about the American story. The clash between freedom and bondage, dignity and degradation, oppression and resistance. His legend insists that no chain is unbreakable, no empire eternal, and that even the most merciless system carries within itself the seeds of its destruction. Abel Johnson's story endures because it speaks to a truth that stretches far beyond the swamps of South Carolina or the era of slavery. It reminds us that the struggle for justice is never truly finished, that each generation must decide whether to accept injustice as the natural order of things, or to risk everything in pursuit of something better. The marshlands that once sheltered Abel have been reshaped by centuries of development, yet they still carry echoes of the world he knew. The abandoned rice fields, the decaying plantation houses built on stolen labor, and the wide, untamed stretches of swamp and forest remain as testaments to both oppression and resistance. In these landscapes, Abel's legend takes root again and again, retold by new voices who find in his story the courage to face their own battles. For some, he is a real man who struck a blow against tyranny and lived to see the spark of freedom ignite. For others, he is a mythic figure born of collective imagination, embodying the spirit of defiance that no system of domination could extinguish. Either way, the meaning is the same. Abel Johnson symbolizes the human refusal to accept chains as permanent, the unyielding belief that freedom is worth any price. Whether or not he existed, as the chronicles claim, is in the end secondary to the impact of his story. What matters is the way his tale reminds us that oppression carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. That resistance, however dangerous or costly, is not only possible, but necessary. The image of Charles Morton's severed head turning on the cotton gin wheel, grisly, shocking, unforgettable, remains one of the most haunting symbols in American memory. And yet within that image lies hope. Hope that no matter how entrenched a system of cruelty may seem, it cannot withstand the determined resistance of those who refuse to be broken.